Dear comrades, on behalf of the Communist Party of Canada, I would first like to express our appreciation for the invitation to participate in this international seminar. Indeed, the international situation is extremely volatile and very dangerous. Imperialism's proxy war in Ukraine threatens to expand as NATO countries and military forces surround Russia. The use of tactical nuclear weapons is being discussed openly, though there is no such thing as a tactical nuclear war. In fact, this is the road to Armageddon. The forces for peace and nuclear disarmament, which have been very weak for almost 2 decades, are finding their voice in Canada in this very dangerous situation, despite the pro-war, Cold War, and anti-communist propaganda that has saturated our country. New peace organizations affiliated to the Canadian Peace Congress and the World Peace Council are forming in Canada's big cities. The Canadian Labour Congress, which met in convention in April, adopted a resolution calling for a peaceful negotiated solution to the war in Ukraine, despite a continuing campaign by right-wing Ukrainian nationalists and the Canadian government to escalate the war and Canada's involvement in it. An immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of all foreign troops, and the negotiation of a political solution is the only way out. And it is urgent, the more so because of U.S. opposition to peace negotiations. Similarly, the campaign to end the 60-year-old blockade of Cuba and to remove Cuba from the list of countries named by the U.S. government as state sponsors of terrorism has growing support in Canada. This is due to the work of the Canadian Network on Cuba and to the fact that over 1 million Canadian tourists visit Cuba every year and can see for themselves the reality of Cuba, its flourishing democracy, equality, its universal health care and education, its new family code, and also the horrendous impact of the blockade and the sanctions imposed by the Biden administration. Cuba is the bright light and inspiration of socialism in the Americas, of national sovereignty and independence, peace and development in this hemisphere. The blockade must be broken, the sanctions dropped, and the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism by the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world has to be stopped. In fact, Canada's foreign policy has shifted from supporter of U.S. imperialist wars and aggression to a leading participant in U.S. military ventures. This includes efforts to overthrow the Maduro government in Venezuela, continuing interventions in Haiti, and the wars on Yugoslavia, Libya, Iraq, Syria, and now the new Cold War on China, which threatens to become a hot war with the formation of AUKUS and the deployment of nuclear-powered submarines in Australia. Canada also has a new policy that will increase our military involvement and interference in that region. Only days ago, a Canadian frigate and a U.S. warship were involved in a near collision with a Chinese ship in the Taiwan Straits. These are very dangerous acts of war. Today, global inflation and the economic recession has hit hard at workers, unemployed and precarious workers, while generating enormous profits and further concentrating and centralizing capital. Its inability to avoid or remediate ever-deepening crises is a sign of capitalism's decay, not its strength. Growing reaction and the reappearance of fascism on every continent is a consequence of capitalism in crisis, and the reason to hurry the struggle for democracy and socialism and the building of a strong and powerful working-class movement. This combines with the global struggle against climate change, for urgent action on carbon emission reductions, and for environmental justice. The impacts of climate change are being felt everywhere, creating catastrophic conditions in countries around the world and generating unprecedented mass migrations and a global refugee crisis. In Canada, corporate greed and power, combined with the policies of the government and the Bank of Canada, has driven down wages, employment, and living standards with 9 interest rate hikes in 15 months, with the promise of more to come. The housing crisis, which was acute before the interest rate hikes, has now become a cause of inflation, as housing prices continue to rise after a brief fall. Homeowners with mortgages are facing huge increases in monthly payments, and banks are preparing for significant numbers of mortgage defaults. Tenants, too, are facing skyrocketing rents and evictions. Interest rate hikes have also affected credit cards, which many working people use to pay for rent and groceries. Personal bankruptcies are rising fast, along with small business bankruptcies. As a result of these policies, Canada has the highest level of household debt amongst the G7 countries, according to the IMF. After a long period of labor peace and quiet, the strike movement is growing as real wages and living standards dive. Building trades, rail and transportation workers, and other private sector unions struck for real wage hikes and COLA, while the public sector unions in healthcare and education linked their demands for better pay and benefits to the fight for better public services. Right-wing provincial governments, which had been chipping away at universal Medicare for more than a decade, moved on to a full-blown offensive this spring, with legislation that encouraged private for-profit healthcare businesses to set up and compete with the public system. The Prime Minister, whose job it is to defend Medicare, called the provincial legislation innovative. In fact, the federal government has been starving hospitals and healthcare for years, creating these conditions in which the provinces can now move. Nurses and healthcare workers have been ringing the bells about the cuts for years, including the province-wide walkout in Alberta. A similar situation exists in public and post-secondary education and throughout the public sectors as the privatizers make their move. At the recent CLC convention, it was evident that workers are ready and willing to fight, and are fighting, on the shop floor and the workplace, in collective bargaining and in defense of public services. Also evident was the poverty of leadership, the absence of a plan of resistance, of mass independent labor political action, which is what the current situation and the delegates urgently called on their leadership to deliver. Our party launched a mass campaign this spring to expose the myth that workers are the cause of inflation, and to demand that the government roll back prices and interest rates, raise wages and incomes, and curb corporate power. We distributed 80,000 leaflets and collected thousands of signatures on our petition to Parliament with these demands. The campaign will continue with new materials until Parliament resumes in the fall, when we will deliver our petitions in a mass protest on Parliament Hill, on the way to further mobilizations after that. Shamefully, the NDP and Greens are largely silent on the impacts and causes of the economic crisis while cheerleading military spending and the war in Ukraine. Key here is the trade union movement and its capacity to mobilize its allies in a mass struggle for jobs, wages, rising living standards, and defense of public services and social programs. We call for a People's Coalition to come together to fight for these economic and social priorities and for an end to war and military spending and to divert these huge expenditures to social spending. These ideas have widespread support in Canada and have contributed to a growing interest in the Communist Party and in socialism. Dear comrades, similar struggles are underway in countries around the world, in various stages of advance or in some cases setbacks by the working class and democratic forces. Canadian Communists stand in solidarity and in unity with all of our comrades in struggle around the world. Capitalism is the problem. The future is socialism. Thank you.